Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. Woohoo! All right, applause. I didn't even ask for it. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm Chris Lane. I'm with Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. Tonight is another Jessica Catto Dialogue speaker series. It's in memory of Jessica Hobby Catto. It was founded by Henry Catto. I want to give a special thanks out to Isa and Daniel Shaw and Isa Catto for their ongoing support. This speaker series is in honor of people that are thinkers and doers and environmental innovators, and we've got one with us tonight. I'm obliged to say this. If you don't know ACEs, we do environmental science education, we do sustainable. I see some agricultural people from our agriculture department. Yes, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you grow food in here. Rock Bottom Ranch, look at the hands going up. We do forest health. Is Adam McCurdy here? I think he's out of town. Forest and climate civic leadership. We do all this while connecting people to nature, which is so critical these days. Let me talk about our speaker. Everyone in life, and raise your hand if you're this way, has one teacher in life that actually affected you, that you actually remember what they taught you. For me, it was Miss Warren, it was math, it was 8th grade Miss Warren, and now I've got a new one. It's Miss Nelson. Because we walked around Hallam Lake today, and I learned so much in less than an hour of being with you. I learned, and I'm gonna have to look at this because it's that amazing. I learned the difference between yucca and yucca. Yucca is cassava. Yucca you can eat. Yucca filamentosa. And if you go online, I don't do social media, but now I do. No, and I didn't think I would ever learn anything from social media. And I learned more looking at your Instagram account. And then I heard this. I heard as you're getting this foraged food and feeding it to your dinner guests, and in the background you hear, it says, and I'm going to have to look at it, it says, "These yucca flowers are effing delicious." Is what was said in the background. It wasn't effing, but you know what word it was. I mean, if you like environmental education, in this case, botany, ethnobotany, wildlife ecology, you're going to like Alexis. If you love food, who doesn't? You're going to like Alexis. If you love entertainment and fun, you're going to like Alexis. And if you care about the environment, you're going to like Alexis. So Alexis is a forager. She's an outdoor educator using her platform to yell, to sing, to celebrate all edible plants hiding in plain sight, which I learned about today. Thank you. She invites us on a journey of foraging and collecting, identifying, and eating wild food. She's cooked up some awards along the way. The Best Social Media, James Beard Award for Best Social Media, 2022. The Forbes 30 Under 30. Who gets to win that? That's a hard one. The TikTok Taste Master, I almost can't say it, the tongue twister. Fortune Magazine's Creator 25 in 2021. And now she's working on her first cookbook. And you all tonight, along with 5 million followers she has on Instagram, it's 5 million and one. You're the first person I followed besides my daughter. That's it. It's my daughter and you. I'm not even joking. Everybody, welcome Alexis Nelson, the Black Forager.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, that is high praise. What the what? Just me and your daughter? How does your daughter feel about this? Oh my goodness, I'm just honored at all of you guys being here with me tonight. Thank you so much. So for those of you who don't know, and maybe if you somehow passed out while Chris was talking and just came to, my name is Alexis. And I'm going to go through a couple quick slides about why I'm going to be sitting here talking very loudly at you. I don't really need this microphone, but I'm thankful for it. Just to give a little bit of my background, including some of my familial background and kind of my family's connection to land in the United States over the last 400 years. Oh, yes, sorry. My own subtitle. You know the feeling. When you're like doing something really fun and you kind of get that nice, comfortable, just in your head. Foraging is one of those things that makes my brain do that. And I think maybe some of you guys too. I think maybe that's why you're here. And then, yes, we are going to talk about how foraging can also help make the world a better place. How about some of our ecosystems? We think so much about humans as only having negative effects on the ecosystems that they live in. But surprise, we can do good things too. Okay, so this painting of a man that I guess I kind of look like. I gotta get an outfit like that for these talks. I think that'll really seal the deal, a nice little ascot. So this is my great ×8 grandfather. His name was Barzillai Lou. His father emigrated to the United States. Well, I say emigrated like he had a say in the matter. He was an indentured servant for a British man, but his family hailed from the Cape Verde Islands, which at that point belonged to Portugal. If you're familiar with northwestern Africa, you might know where that is. But a really cool thing happened in that his father was one of the few indentured servants who was able to actually pay off his debt and was able to become a landowner. And so my mom's family in Massachusetts were landowning farmers in the 16 and 1700s, which is kind of outrageous to think about for any people of color, even in the northeastern United States. But because of trying to get to know this land that they were now inhabiting, there was a whole lot of knowledge transfer between their family and the Wampanoag Native Americans that also inhabited and still inhabit those lands where my family farm used to be. So I like to think that it's kind of been in our blood to be interacting with these spaces ever since we got here, trying to act as indigenous to place as a person not originally from here can possibly be, which I think informs a lot of what I do out in the world. So gotta throw old Barzillai up there. He was important enough to get a portrait because he fought in the Revolutionary War, for better or for worse. I have some very mixed feelings about that. Boo, British colonialism, but then we were the colonial power. Oopsies. It's crazy how that happens. I'm like, yeah, you tell King George III that he can go F off. But, oh wait, no, now you guys are stealing the land. Oh, man. If you're ever at the Smithsonian African American History Museum, his portrait is hanging there too. So you can wave hi and be like, oh, he's related to that loud lady I know. That's my Nana. Yeah, she's no longer with us, but she taught me so much of what I know about how to be a respectful person in the outdoors. Whether that was maybe or maybe not giving me a spanking in public for throwing a Cheerio at a goose's head. In my defense, Canada geese are very mean. But also, she saw a teachable moment, so she ran with it, asked me how I'd like it if someone threw Cheerios at my head. And I was like, well, can my mouth be open? And she was just like, and I was like, okay, sorry, no more jokes. Yes, we have to treat animals the way that we want to be treated. Or even better, because that's the golden rule, I live by the platinum rule, which is treating things the way they want to be treated. I know, if you were looking to like ever blow some people's minds, that's a real good one to pull out at the dinner party. Just be like, oh, we've all heard of the golden rule, but get ready. But I owe a lot more to my Nana than just reminding me that the things around us aren't things, they're living beings, just like the rest of us are. When she was a child, one of 9 children, couldn't be me. Love my great-grandparents, couldn't be me. When they were growing up, she had to work in a cranberry bog along with some of her siblings as a teenager. She actually dropped out of school after 8th grade so she could work and help to support her family. But when she grew up and ended up having daughters of her own, one thing that she was really dead set on for them and then for all of us grandchildren was getting to spend time in the outdoors on our own accord. Not because we were having to for someone else to make money, not to be gathering food that would never make it to our community's plates, but so that we could just cultivate our own love and our own relationships with the wild spaces that we're lucky enough to get to interact with. And so because of her, my mom, hi Mom, I keep forgetting, I need to change this picture. She came to my lecture once and pulled me aside after and pulled me in real close, and I thought she was going in for a hug, and she said, "That's the picture you used." And I was like, I thought this was going to be a sentimental moment. I think she looks very distinguished and professional in this photograph. I think orange is very much her color. But when she was growing up, because my Nana was intent on her getting to know the outdoors, she went to sleepaway camp up in the mountains in New Hampshire and in Maine, and it was so formative for her getting to know all of the trees and the plants and the animals that me and my little sister got sent to overnight camp as kids too, and And she really has always kind of been the biggest advocate during my love of picking things up off of the ground and finding out what they are and who they're from and what their story is. I loved how like every picture I found of her and me outside, I had something in my hands. And I was like, oh, people are gonna think I chose this one on purpose. No, they're all like this. And she was really busy when I was growing up. She was a business person. She worked for Procter & Gamble. She was traveling, honestly, for about half of the year, any given year, for the first 13 years of my life. So when she was home, we were like, it's bonding time. Let's go outside. And we'd work in the garden together, and she would quiz me on the Latin names of all of the plants, and we'd walk around the neighborhood and gossip about other people's gardens. Be like, oh my God, did you see that they put in a weeping cherry tree? Get a native species. What are we even doing here? It's gonna shade out your echinaceas, and they're gonna have a bad time. And I'd be like, yeah, the echinaceas. But one thing that stands out to me, and probably one of my earliest memories, was being 5 and my mom pointing out onion grass, which is a feral garlic that grows a lot on the eastern side of the country to me, and saying, oh, break this and give it a smell, and you're overwhelmed with the smell of garlic, and it smells delicious, and your mouth starts watering. And I was like, oh my God, Mom, when did you put these here? And she's like, oh, they're just here by accident. They're just here hanging out, and you can collect them and eat them if you want to. And that blew my mind. I was like, so there's just things we can eat? And she's like, mm-hmm. I'm like, and nobody put them there? Mm-hmm. And you won't get in trouble if you eat them? And that got all of the gears in my little 5-year-old brain turning, and they're still turning to this day. Oh, that's me working at the summer camp. That's Bug. Oh, I guess his real name's Ryan. He doesn't like it when people call him Bug anymore. He's in college now, which hurts me deeply. So then I got to go and have the pleasure on a small scale of getting to teach a bunch of kids at the same camp that I grew up going to, all of the same plant friends that I made when I was their age. Be like, oh, this is my favorite black walnut tree. You might roll an ankle, but the nuts are amazing. Oh my God, over here, it's the garlic mustard. It's invasive. Eat all of it. And I never thought that I'd find a job more fitting for who I was as a person than this. And I don't know if you know this, but camp counselors don't make a lot of money. So my mom was like, oh, why don't you go and get a college degree so you don't have to do this for the rest of your life? But I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. But I did. I went to college. I studied environmental science and theater. It shows, I know. When will the theater kids atone for their sins? Who's to say? I'll sign the document when they're ready with it. But then, after getting my degrees, I was like, cool, I'm gonna work in the outdoors. And the world of the outdoors was like, cool, it's really hard to find a good paying job here. And I was like, sick, I'm gonna work in marketing instead, sorry. Girls gotta eat. So I worked for BarkBox for a couple of years. That's T-Pain. He let me tie like 17 dogs to him for a music video. That was fun. He did not have a good time once we let go of those dogs. We got one take before T-Pain says, I'm out. Fair enough. But while I was working at Bark, doing my 9 to 5, I was foraging where no one could see me. Thank you, yes. Technically, field garlic. They're cousins, they're both alliums. A lot of people call them chives. It's one of the issues with common names. It's why my mom used to quiz me on the Latin. I hated it. But now I get it. And that makes me very angry. It's like, what do you mean all those years of taking Latin are paying off? How dare you? And while I was doing all of this foraging, a lot of which arose from, you know, the normal thing of graduating from college and being kind of broke and not wanting to just live off of ramen every single day. Or if you are gonna live off of ramen, you want it to be fancy ramen. You wanna have field garlic, you wanna have curly dock leaves, and maybe even some crackers you made with the curly dock seeds. You wanna throw some giant hyssop leaves in there. You want it to be fancy. And after a while, I wanted to start keeping track of all of my fancy recipes that I was making, and my family following my personal Instagram was getting very annoyed with them, so I made a separate page. And that is the page known as Black Forager. Hero, origin story. Hero, origin story. Yeah, there she is. Being a weirdo in front of her phone. What kind of, oh, I think that was pineapple weed pudding in the goblet. I was trying to remember what I was taking photos of that day. Pineapple weed grows a lot around here. Loves coming up in the pavement. Got to introduce it to some people earlier today. And a lot of people stared at me while I was collecting some in downtown Aspen yesterday. If you ever want people to leave you alone, be the one eating wild, unidentifiable things. 10 out of 10 would recommend. People will give you a wide radius. It's kind of nice sometimes. And what started as me just documenting something that I loved for me and my friends who were also nerdy about the same thing kind of accidentally exploded. As those types of things are oft wont to do. And soon I was getting to like travel around the world and give TED Talks. Those are my TED mentors. In British Columbia, eating a ton of, does anybody know the plant? Yeah! Thank you. Super invasive. If you see it, please eat it. It's Japanese knotweed. Giant knotweed also occasionally makes inroads here too, but Japanese knotweed is usually the one that you're going to see. It's delicious, very tart, super tasty. I like it a little bit better than rhubarb, which is a controversial statement in some circles. Also, its very extensive and hard to eliminate rhizome system is a great dupe for turmeric. So I don't know why people aren't eating it into submission. That's what we tried to do that day. We also got to feed it to a bunch of feral bunnies. British Columbia has a weird pet bunnies that have been released problem. That's not what our talk is about today. But if you go to British Columbia and you go to the beach and you see the feral bunnies, they will eat Japanese knotweed out of your hands and you will feel like Snow White. 10 out of 10 would recommend to a friend. So that's why I'm here. Now, let's talk about the history of the United States when it comes to foraging. I heard some groans. Correct response. We're gonna try and make it as lighthearted as possible, and we'll see how that goes. Isn't that what it always does? Almost or completely ruins things. So, I was actually very excited to be giving this talk on the western side of the country because a lot of the species and a lot of the remaining kind of food forests remain on this side of the country. Is it because by the time colonists got here, they were like, oh, you mean the indigenous people are people? Oh, that's crazy. Oh man, I really wish someone had told us that before. Everything on that side of the Mississippi River, I'm feeling a little bit guilty about that now. But this is an aerial example of one of the fragments of a remaining maintained indigenous food forest in British Columbia. And this was not abnormal across the country 500, 600 years ago. A lot of these very productive, multiple species in season at the same time, maintained ecosystems in which it was never really monocultured. Maybe you would burn an area to kill back certain plants and incite other ones to grow. We're seeing a lot of controlled burns coming into the forefront of the conservation conversation for that very reason. But unfortunately, for some of these food forests on the eastern side of the country, people did not know what they were looking at when they got here. So De Soto and a lot of Spanish explorers were some of the first to kind of make inroads from Europe into continental North America and South, Central, and Southern, the United States before it was the United States. And one of the things that De Soto actually wrote about like a weird amount of times was how prolific some of these spaces that they walked through were in terms of food. So I pulled a couple of my favorite quotes. So you don't have to read De Soto's journals. It's not high on my recommendation list. I had to read it for a class. If you don't have to, I wouldn't recommend it. But one of the quotes is, the trees grow wild in the fields without being planted, lie, or manured, lie, and are as large and as vigorous as if they were cultivated and irrigated in gardens. Thank you. Yeah, I wonder. Interesting. Tell us more, De Soto. And he says, in the open fields were many plums, both those of Spain, they were not the ones of Spain, and those of the land, and grapes along the rivers on vines, climbing up into the trees. Oh my God, sounds beautiful, sounds idyllic. How could this have possibly happened? The land was very pleasing and fertile and had excellent fields along the rivers, the forest being clear and having many walnuts and mulberries. So they got here and were just like, this place is pretty nice. What if we stayed and also changed everything? But it's okay, because while we're doing the work of changing everything, we have all of these delicious foods that we have no clue how they got here to live off of. Amazing. And honestly, it's unfortunate that a lot of these food forests and how well they were maintained by the indigenous groups living there were a lot of the reasons why conquistadors and early English and Dutch settlers truly believed that God wanted them to be here. They saw these spaces that looked nothing remotely like what farming looked like back at home to them. And at that point could not wrap their heads around people purposefully keeping spaces to look like this. So they got there. They thought, since it was so easy to live off of all of these crops, many of which the indigenous people shared with them the knowledge of, that it meant they had to have been supposed to be there. Knock, knock. I had to put the happy face there because we know it's sad face. I felt like I needed something there to soften the blow. And it couldn't be an emoji, that'd be too silly. So we went old school smiley face. So, like I was just saying, a lot of Europeans came in, and because of how productive and seemingly empty a lot of these forests were, they were empty because a lot of people died of diseases that Europeans brought here. And also Europeans killed and moved a lot of them too. Let's not. I always am just like, I don't want anyone to get too sad or be like, I don't know if any of your family members have been here since then. Some of mine have been. I feel weird about it too. But we also have to be honest with each other. We're all friends here. And as the colonial powers moved across North America, bringing their idea of what agriculture looks like, we started losing all of these beautiful, biodiverse, highly productive spaces. There have been some approximations in studies that think that if you're going strictly by calorie and by how much can be harvested during different seasons during the course of the year, that some of these food forests were 5 to 10 times more productive than like our corn and soy fields are in the middle of the country now. So it's pretty heartbreaking to know that we've lost a lot of those spaces. And unfortunately, what colonialism also did a huge number on was foraging. Funny enough, when specifically the British got here, a huge deal in Britain in King George III's time was not touching, looking at, or even thinking too hard about the king's forest. You can't go there. Don't let us catch you catching anything there or eating anything there. If you do, you're going to get punished. And what's your punishment? Going to the American colonies. So it's very easy to see why when the British first got here, they were like, oh, screw those rules. We're not going to have any trespassing laws. Everyone can eat food wherever they want to. Screw the king. But it's very interesting how things started changing once we did become our own sovereign country. A lot of those rules started getting taken out of the proposed charters from different states because suddenly folks were like, oh, wait, no, I actually fought for this. Oh, awkward. If you could go catch fish somewhere else, actually. Or I'll like shoot you with my little musket. I hope that's cool. Good talk. Their little powdered wigs. So even though one of honestly the big ideas that the colonies were founded on was this idea of lack of trespass and land access for all, the tide did start changing after the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of states started forming their own law charters. So that was the first nail in the coffin for foraging and access to wild food here in the United States, other than losing a lot of those food forests. Knock, knock. I love the person who said knock, knock. Because that would also be me. Be like, oh, big words on the screen, I'm gonna say them. Thank you. I feel seen right now. But yeah, knock, knock. Stop answering the door! You guys, we saw who was there last time. Look at the people or something first. Jeez. So, unfortunately, another and a deceptively large nail in the coffin of wild food access in the United States did come in the form of legalized racism. Now, in the southeastern United States, where my dad's family is from, if you were an enslaved person working on a plantation, not only was it expected for you to know how to forage and hunt and trap, it was necessary. On most large plantations, all enslaved people were given were cornmeal, and who knows how good it still is, and fatback. And if you don't know what fatback is, it's like if you take the fat and meat ratio of bacon and then reverse it. It's not amazing for you. Those two things alone do not a full diet make, unless you want your poops to be real uncomfortable. And those two things alone do not make up a proper diet for someone who is doing manual labor for 13 hours a day for a large portion of the year. So on the land, it wasn't even they weren't turning a blind eye to it. They were encouraging enslaved people to trade knowledge with indigenous folks in the southern United States and hoping that they would just supply the rest of their own calories through berry foraging in the spring and the summertime, by being able to catch their own fish, by being able to set snares and trap rabbits and squirrels and chipmunks. But then the Emancipation Proclamation happened. And then a few months later, when the plantation owners felt like actually telling people that the Emancipation Proclamation happened, suddenly, the plantation owners noticed something very interesting. I've pulled a couple journal entries and newspaper clippings from the era, all coming out of South Carolina. They were like, uh-oh, we just freed all of these people, and they are really good at taking care of themselves because we didn't take care of them. Yeah, I mean, when you tell somebody, okay, go and look after your own community, find out what's in season and when, and find out how to preserve it and live off of it best as you can, people are gonna keep doing that once you free them because they had no reason not to. So what ended up happening is they gave them a reason not to. Because these enslaved people didn't want to come back and work on these plantations as sharecroppers, making a couple pennies a day to do the work that they were previously doing for free. So what happened first in South Carolina, which then spread like wildfire to all of the other existing states in the United States at the time, was criminalizing trespass. Literally making it a criminal offense to go onto someone else's land for any reason, but especially if you were going onto their land to try and get food for yourself and your family. And what happens after those laws pass is a few people go to the same spaces they've been harvesting food for years now, in some cases for now generations. And what happens is they don't get a small slap on the wrist, they don't get a big fine, they get jailed. And it's already hard enough to take care of your family when you're having to live off of foraged food. You really can't be taking care of your family from inside of a jail cell when you're being held for a bail bond that's too high for you to be able to afford because you haven't built up any wealth. You've been working for free for your entire life. And so it didn't take very long for Black folks to go, okay, well, you can only forage on land that you own, and we don't own any land. So I guess we have to go back to working for some of these people, because all that we really can hope to do is make enough money to keep ourselves afloat and maybe afford a parcel of land at some point in the future. But what some people didn't expect to happen is not only did that prohibit Black folks from foraging, it also prohibited Indigenous people from foraging. It also prohibited white people who didn't own land from foraging. So suddenly, the group of people that held the wealth of this wild food knowledge were cut off. And it doesn't take much more than a generation for knowledge, no matter how deeply instilled it is in a group of people, to get lost. You see people move to the United States from other countries, and parents will want to fit in so well they won't speak their mother tongue with their kids, and then they'll end up with grandchildren who are heartbroken that they can't speak the languages of their people. And what the United States witnessed en masse was watching that happen with wild food. Now, of course, there were some people who kept that knowledge alive even if they weren't able to be using it themselves. But what was a pastime and a means of living for hundreds of thousands of people disappeared overnight because someone wanted to be racist. It's one of those things where you think it's just gonna negatively affect one group of people, but in a weird way, it kind of ends up coming back to bite everybody in the end. So we go a couple decades, we go through the Reconstruction, and we go through the beginning of the 20th century with foraging not being part of the American ethos by and large. As people are moving out west and starting to live in and colonize these spaces, you'd see it show up in little pockets, going and flipping through old newspaper articles or people's journals. But for the most part, something that had become kind of important in America disappeared. But then World War II happened. And when World War II was happening, food rations were also going on. And as much as I want to believe that every single one of us in this room could grow an amazing victory garden with no issues, and everything would be amazing, and the carrots definitely wouldn't be this big, and you'd definitely get more than like 7 tomatoes in a season. Victory gardens, as much as we love to evangelize and eulogize about them in American history textbooks today, those were not feeding so many families. Expecting a bunch of people to suddenly be like, oh, okay, know how to do this now. Especially because some of the women who were staying behind were just like, oh, I just got like a real job and now I have to do this? Sick, awesome, great, thank you, love that, awesome. So one thing that did have a huge resurgence in popularity during World War II was foraging, which it had been on the upswing during the Great Depression, and especially in a lot of the Dust Bowl states where we lost a lot of agricultural land to begin with. But it got so popular that the USDA reached out to their favorite food scientist at the time, in his old age, Mr. George Washington Carver, and they had him write a pamphlet to send out to housewives across the country called Nature's Garden for Peace and Bounty. And he went through a bunch of the states and just asked everyone that he could about the little bits and pieces of foraging knowledge that they had, put it together into a book, which you can read for free on archive.org if you're ever feeling curious. And then they printed it en masse and sent it to thousands of homes to help people be able to stretch food and make ends meet until food rations were lifted. So for a hot second in the 1940s, knowing how to make like wild raspberry preserves and making them better than your neighbor Barbara down the street was a cool thing to be doing. And if there's anything we know about American pop culture is that if it's cool, people are gonna do it. Even if they don't really like it that much, people are gonna do it. It's just the way that it goes. Now, when all of those soldiers came home, baby boom started, people frolic out into suburbia in search of their white picket fence and their 2.5 children. I don't know about the 0.5 child. I hope they're all right. What ended up happening was ring the bell. Someone looked through the Amazon doorbell. Oh, who is that I see? All of those houses and lawns had to go somewhere. They weren't going in the cities because that's where poor people with lifty, heavy jobs live. So it's gonna have to be outside of the cities. What's outside the cities? Nature. And nobody wanted a white picket fence surrounding a tall grass prairie. They wanted it surrounding beautiful, like Kentucky blue. I don't know anything about lawns. I got out of having to take that class for my degree because I thought it was pointless and colonial. And so we lost a lot of the spaces where people were having a blast foraging 10 years earlier. And not only that, but especially with the advent of things like television and TV shows showing you what the perfect family looks like and what they eat and what they wear. The idea of keeping up with the Joneses became very prevalent, especially in suburban America. And if there's one thing you didn't want to do, and my parents both vouch for this, you didn't want to look poor. You didn't want to look like you were wanting, like you weren't doing well enough for yourselves. And when people caught other folks foraging, that was the assumption that they made. You know, if Leave It to Beaver's family isn't foraging, then I won't be foraging either. And so, once again, in the American psyche, wild food and access to wild food falls to the wayside. And as suburbia continues to sprawl, there is a recognition that we need to preserve some of our natural spaces. And we do so in the form of state and national parks and forests. But as any of you who are interested in foraging are probably well aware, there are some pretty strict rules about foraging or harvesting of any kind in those spaces. American ethnobotany didn't really exist quite yet, and the way that scientists looked at the natural world was as if it was a museum, something that you needed to lock up behind glass and not shine too bright of lights on and not touch. The belief was if people touched it, people would ruin it, which had to have been a huge slap in the face for a lot of indigenous tribes who, one, lost a ton of their land to the creations of these national parks, and two, were like, hi, my ancestors literally made it look this way? How are you gonna tell me that all people interacting with it is gonna be bad for it? And they're like, we actually don't want to engage with that question right now. I hate when past me hides little jokes and current me gets so wrapped up that I forget about them. So disrespectful. But then, in the late 1960s, a man emerges. And he's very personable. They love having him on the late night talk shows, and he's published a couple best-selling books, the most famous of which is called Stalking the Wild Asparagus. This is our good friend Yule Gibbons. He is no longer with us, not because of wild food. He had a heart attack like an American. I just feel like I have to specify that because when you show Forager and you say dead, everyone assumes the worst. He lived to old age. No poison, just trans fats. You know, it happens to everybody. But with the popularity of his book and with how personable and enigmatic he seemed on all of these TV shows, suddenly, especially within the hippie counterculture, there arises this want to participate in foraging again, to unearth some of this old knowledge. For some people, it even was going and talking to indigenous groups and asking them about what species they were cultivating and interacting and having relationships with. And while it hadn't made it to academia yet, you were starting to see these little ripples in the United States of foraging returning somewhere towards its former glory. And now, with the wonder/nightmare of TikTok and other social medias, being able to access this kind of information has become easier than it ever has before. I mean, that's the reason why I'm standing in front of all of you right now, is now you can open your phone and it's not tracking down an old book that's falling apart in your library's archives. It's just getting to see what Linda Black Elk is up to this week, or seeing what Sam Thayer foraged around another gas station this week. His videos doing that are great. I highly recommend them. And you see a lot of these more artsy cookbooks starting to emerge, like Forage Harvest Feast or The Forager's Pantry, things that are suddenly posturing wild food as something in vogue, something fancy. You know, the top restaurant in the world right now is Noma. Almost everything is like foraged or hunted or gathered within 50 miles, and that's why no one can get a seat there ever. It's also in Copenhagen, so it's a little unattainable for all of us anyway. I'm just mad because I'm not gonna get to go before it closes. That's between me and them. But now, foraging has suddenly become fancy, which is very exciting because when people think something's fancy, they want to participate in it. But one thing that makes me a little sad is I'm like, no, foraging's for everybody. It can be fancy, absolutely. You know, I look at the posts from some of these restaurants of the beautiful flambe cattail fritters that they're making, and I'm like, oh yeah. But I just mixed up my cattails with a little bit of flour and fried them up in some olive oil, and those were pretty delicious too. So one thing that I want to talk about is a question that I honestly get asked pretty frequently, and it's, okay, so foraging's popular again. Great, cool, awesome. We love reclaiming things our ancestors did, woo. But isn't everybody being into foraging going to F up the environment? And I can see why someone would ask that. The United States does not have the strongest track record for how we treat our outdoor spaces or anything cool and rare. Passenger pigeons. George and Martha. Sorry, I grew up being overly attached to the idea of passenger pigeons because like the shrine to them is at the Cincinnati Zoo that I grew up going to. And so, yeah, I was just like, I was one of those kids who grew up being like, man, humans can't do anything good. we just ruin everything. I just want to be like a moose or a deer. It's being a human's dumb. But being a human is not dumb, because what humans can do is recognize patterns, recognize whether they are doing harm or doing good, and then change their behavior. So I wanted to talk about a couple examples of documented good foraging. The first of which is from my dad's family's neck of the woods. This plant is sochan. That is the Cherokee name. It is more often known in gardens as cutleaf coneflower, Rudbeckia lanceolata, if you are nasty. Sometimes I do have to remind people, I'm in a silly dress, but I went to school. And for thousands of years, the Cherokee and other southern Midwestern and northern Southeastern tribes harvested sochan grains every spring. They're pretty toe-to-toe with kale in terms of their nutritional makeup. So you can see why, especially early in the spring, after living off of preserved foods, getting to eat something like this would be really important. We have a lot of coneflower species on this side of the country that were used similarly when they would put out their first set of basil leaves every spring. But some of the biggest populations of this plant are within Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And Great Smoky Mountain National Park also used to be the hub of the Cherokee Nation before we made them walk a ton of miles in that trail made out of tears. I have to phrase it like a joke because it's really sad. And so about 15 years ago, some of the tribal elders from a portion of the tribe that has moved back around Smoky Mountain National Park asked for permission for at least their tribal members to be able to go in and harvest. And at first, the National Park Service said, yeah, no. And they said, well, why not? And they said, because there's no way that you guys harvesting this is going to have a positive impact on the population. And they said, oh, bet. Which is the thing that the kids say when they're like, oh, really? Oh, and okay, well, I'll take that challenge. And so what they did is, with a lot of their own funding and fundraising, they ran a 10-year study and tracked the population growth while still gathering those initial rosettes of leaves. And in the areas where they were being gathered from, the population grew. And in the areas that were not being gathered from, the population stayed the same. And it's very hard for the Park Service to argue with hard numbers. They'll try, but it's hard. And so this is really recent. This is just within the last 5 years that the Cherokee Nation has been given permission to go in and harvest sochan every spring, because it's obvious that their ancestors practiced. They knew what they were doing. There's a reason why it was still around for us to see today. So I just love getting to point it out. I grow it in my garden now. It's one of my favorite plants. Sochan greens are delicious. You are ignoring the leaves of all of the coneflowers and sunflowers. You are missing out on a tasty treat. Does anybody know what this plant is? It is garlic mustard. Yep. Does anybody know what this plant is? Yeah, exactly. And I love the slight about ramps because same. Because Martha Stewart wrote some article about them in 2006, they are the poster child for haute couture foraging. And because of that, people will come into my neck of the woods with trash bags and fill them up with ramps, which famously can take 7 years to reach maturity. So not necessarily a guy you just want to be digging up sans abandon. But interestingly enough, what's having a worse impact on their population numbers is not ramp poachers taking them to restaurants in New York and Chicago. It's this guy right here. I know that you guys have similar issues with another brassica that we're going to talk about in a second. Something that's really fun and kooky about a lot of the brassicas is they're allelopathic. And what that means is they secrete chemicals from their roots that make other plants die. Womp, womp. And, and how did it get here? Because British people like eating it. Literally, it's one of the plants that they brought over as a food crop and then just went, oopsies, when it escaped all of the places it was supposed to. Because one of these plants can produce tens of thousands of seeds in a season. Why I tell people, go make mustard with the seeds. It's delicious. It's delicious. So an example that I give when I am leading foraging walks is like, oh, you want to know something that you can forage and do a solid for your local ecosystem? Eat this guy before you even think about eating this guy. There was a patch of woods not too far from my house where we took 4 years of every year pulling up all of these guys and not throwing them away, taking them home, making pesto. The roots taste like horseradish. Like, for a pain in the butt, it is delicious. Sometimes when I'm eating the pesto, I'm like, okay, Britz, I get it. I see why you thought you couldn't live without this. Wish you would talk to somebody about it first. And only now in the last couple of years, after watching the ramp population explode, have we now felt comfortable, and we don't even harvest the bulbs. We go and take a couple of leaves out of the patch each year. I'd like to see it can fill in a little bit more before anyone thinks about going in and thinning them. But I will say, and if you're in any foraging Facebook groups, one, I'm sorry. They are my greatest joy and my greatest headache. If you ever see me arguing with anybody in them, please tell me to stop. Their minds aren't going to change, and I know that inside. But Sam Thayer, who is kind of like the cool uncle of the foraging community right now, just finished a 10-year study on his own property of ramp populations and whether or not you go through and thin out bulbs in thick clusters, which traditionally in a lot of Midwestern indigenous groups is what was done, how that would affect the populations, and it helps them because you're giving the smaller bulbs space to grow and fill into. And ramp seeds are very heavy, so they tend to just kind of fall where they grew, which makes them form really dense clumps. And that's not healthy for plants. It's not good when you forget to repot your plants inside. I should be looking in a mirror right now. And it's also not good for the plants that you want to eat in the outdoors. So, harvesting one, good for the other, and means in the future, you can harvest the other. A lot of people hate waiting, so they roll their eyes when I tell them this, but I'm like, hey, I gave you the information, that's all I can do. So, who knows what this plant is? It is sweetgrass. Here, Chloe odorata. We love her. She's very important to so many different indigenous tribes and grows across so much of the United States. I was looking at her native range today, and I was like, oh, she's a cosmopolitan girly. I see why they called you the hair of Mother Earth. You're everywhere. That's wild. And who in here has read Braiding Sweetgrass? Yeah, you knew I was going to ask. You knew I was going to ask. The TLDR, first of all, the real TLDR is go read it. It'll change your life. Robin Wall Kimmerer is amazing. I open mouth sobbed at her last year. I don't get starstruck except her. I met Beyonce once, and I open mouth sobbed at Robin Wall Kimmerer. And if that doesn't tell you who I am, I don't know what does. One of the studies that she conducted as a professor was whether or not tending to, visiting with, and harvesting sweetgrass was better for sweetgrass populations as opposed to leaving it alone. And because sweetgrass spreads more prolifically through its rhizomes than it does actually through its seeds, which have a very low germination rate, do not try to grow sweetgrass from seeds. Please, let me have done that for you. Don't do it. If you want to grow it, find someone who's nice and will give you rhizomes instead. Save yourself a couple years of heartache. And surprisingly enough, tended to patches tend to not just stay the same, they expand. And patches of sweetgrass that you don't tend to, as I have also found out the hard way, tend to die. I was so afraid of doing anything with the sweetgrass in my front yard that I didn't touch it for 2 years, and it didn't come back this year. There are a lot of plants, we think about the relationships between species that have grown together for thousands and thousands of years. And this is an example of a species that's grown together with us. It's so easy to think of us as being separate from that entire system. But of course, there are species that have grown to do better with a little bit of interjection from a human hand, and this is one of them. But, oh, that was the laser button. It's kind of fun, though. There she is. Yeah, so on this side of the country, the one that you guys have the garlic mustard problem with is this guy. Who's this? It's black mustard. That's fine. You have a lot of wild brassicas around here that don't play by the rules. But black mustard is one that was brought by a lot of Spanish folks making their way up the West Coast, and the rumor, the story that is told, I'm told by my cousins who went to public school in California while they were having to build little models of the little Spanish churches, is that the monks would spread this where they'd walked, so when they bloomed, they could see where they had been previously, which is a really bad reason to grow a plant. I know I don't need to tell you that, but just in case I did, bad reason to grow a plant, especially a plant that, once again, tens of thousands of seeds each year. Because now, across a lot of the western United States, where you used to see prairie, or even where you used to see a lot of beautiful understory plants growing underneath different species of pines and oaks, you see a lot of this. And let me tell you, Californians on Instagram love this. They're just like, oh my God, super bloom. I'm like, oh, it's not even the right species. You don't even know what you're talking about. This is why I shouldn't be on the internet. Because every day I see someone posting something like that, or I see a clip from a movie and they're like, it's fall, and I'm like, that apple tree is blooming. This isn't the time of year apple trees bloom. Fix it. Black mustard and a lot of the other non-native brassicas around here, love spreading, are delicious. And when you pull them up, a lot of more aggressive native species love to fill into that nicely, freshly aerated soil. How is it aerated? By you pulling it up by the roots. It's the best feeling ever, and they really do come up so nicely, especially after a light rain. If you're ever wanting to go through the streets of Aspen and do everyone a solid, wait until after a light rainstorm and go after all of the brassicas. And some of the pineapple weed too, and they're all delicious. But a species that I had a lot of fun learning about, and that was new to me, and that I learned about doing research ahead of coming here, was, oh, okay, let's see if I can say the Ute word for it. Numuvopiav. I tried my best, and I'm very sorry. But unfortunately, it has a name that probably will not be used for much longer. Its colloquial name is Indian ricegrass. And much like with wild paintbrush, I'm like, ooh, in 2024? When I was looking at the USDA's website, I was like, ooh, buddy, what year is it? Come on now. How have we not come up with a better name? But this species is endemic to where we are right now, and was and continues to be an important grain crop for members of the different Ute tribes. But the key to helping them proliferate is in the way that you gather them. And I also loved learning about this because it's really similar to how we gather wild rice in the Midwest. And the lack of gathering is actually a huge reason why our wild rice populations have been declining in the Great Lakes. Because what you would do is you would take your basket to collect the grain, and you would take a long stick that was pretty sturdy, and you would walk up to one of these bunches after they have flowered and the grains are full and hard inside of their husks, hold your basket underneath, and then you'd hit the plants into the basket. And would your basket catch most of them? Yes. But would your basket catch all of them? No. So what ends up happening is humans end up helping this plant spread more prolifically. Because if the humans didn't come and eat it, the moose and the bears would, and they don't care. A moose sees this, they're not like, oh, I need to make sure I knock some of this over so it can grow back next year real nice and proper like. No, a moose is just gonna open its giant mouth. I've never seen a moose. I just hear that they're bigger than you expect them to be. And just go like, chomp. Carbohydrates. And then continue on his moosey way, getting ready for the winter time. So what we've actually witnessed over the last 100 years is this particular plant, outside of where it's being grown in gardens, it's dwindling. Its population has been shrinking because people aren't going and gathering it the way that they used to. And a lot of people don't even know that it exists, which is equally heartbreaking in my opinion. And I was like, ooh, maybe I can get to tell people about a plant they didn't know about before. Or maybe everyone already knows about it and they're like, oh, that loud girl from the internet, she's so silly. Either way, aren't we having a great time? But yeah, if you are a dork like me and you want to do some ethnobotanical reading, the Southern Ute tribe did an excellent ethnobiographical study of a lot of Colorado a couple of years ago, and it's very easy to find on the internet. And this is one of the species that they spent a whole lot of time paying attention to. Because yeah, living through the winter when you don't have a refrigerator, here it's pretty hard. Not necessarily something that I would like to do, but if I had a tasty grain to help with it, it'd make things a little bit better. So that section was foraging for preservation. Another thing that I think is really important about foraging that I think we've lost is the community aspect of it. And that's something I see missing from a lot of modern day foraging. Food was never something that one person was doing. In a group, whether you're going back hundreds or thousands of years in Europe or in Africa or here in North America or in Asia, food was a communal activity. And never do I remember that more than when I go up to Minnesota and go to the Dakota Wapato camp each year at Prairie Island. And it's just a bunch of us in the headwaters of the Mississippi dancing tubers out of the mud with our feet and getting real muddy and catching up with each other and watching the kids just become mud monsters. I feel so bad for everyone who has to take one of those children home. I'm just like, we gotta start bringing buckets of water. Because I would not let that into my vehicle. And if one person was going and gathering Wapato by themselves, which Wapato, also native here, loves hanging out near fresh water, you'd get a couple tubers, but not that many. But when an entire community goes out together and everyone's in their own little patches near one another, we end up with thousands of tubers in one afternoon. And then we all clean them together, we all skin them together, and then we make a huge meal and invite all of the tribal elders and everyone else from the community. And my heart doesn't feel more full during many other times. There's something really magical about getting to share the entirety of a food experience with people that you care about, and knowing that something you did physically is now nourishing them physically and nourishing you. And we're so disconnected from our food systems these days that I love seeing that foraging is having its moment again. But I'm always like, oh, you want to go make some acorn flour? Why not have an acorn party with your friends? Everyone goes out with baskets together. You all come home and take turns cracking nuts open while you have a movie or something silly on the television, or sitting around a fire and catching up. So one thing that I always like to encourage people to do is to not forage alone. Also, what if you see a bear? It took me seeing a bear once for me to be like, oh, solo foraging is not for me. Whoopsie daisies. Thankfully, the bear was just as afraid of I am because I look like this on the trail. Also, foraging, I never want to be the person ever talking about like the health of foods because I don't like saying that some foods are good and some foods are bad as a person who dealt with an eating disorder earlier in my life. But I will say that if you forage pretty frequently throughout the year, you're gonna do a good job of getting a lot of different micro and macronutrients that you wouldn't necessarily always be getting from, like the Honey Nut Cheerios that you're having in the morning. That was a bad example. We fortify the crap out of cereal now. But like, I don't know, the French fries that you are having regularly with your lunch. And so I do like to remind people, not only is it good for your mind and good for your heart, it can be really good for your body too. I'm chronically low on iron, so I love Wapato season. It's a wonder I haven't passed out yet. And last, and this is also a recent ad, is foraging for mental health. There are a lot of studies all coming out of Japan, which, having just been there, makes sense. When you're on a train at 9:30 p.m. and it is filled with sad business people in their suits just coming home from work, you're like, oh no, you guys, no, stop. You actually need to quit your job and go hug a tree. You are all too stressed and you're working too hard. And like, we work a lot in the United States compared to some European countries, but Japan is on another level. And so because of that, we're seeing a lot of studies coming out of Japan right now, talking about mental health, helping with depressive tendencies, and helping with acute anxiety disorders, not just with medication, but medication in conjunction with spending time outside, or in some of these studies, just spending time outside. If, once again, you are a dork like me, I would look into that top study. It's a banger and will make you feel really good about all the time that you're outside, not necessarily doing anything else productive. You're like, excuse me, this is productive for my brain. And if my brain's not productive, the rest of me isn't productive. So do I have to tell myself that sometimes? Yes, yeah, 100%, absolutely. And what I will leave you with is one of my favorite things to witness happening when teaching kids foraging classes especially, or teaching the kids in my neighborhood about foraging, is watching how quickly their love for their surroundings kind of blossoms out of nowhere. I live in a pretty urban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. It's not always the best taken care of, but watching the way that so many of the kids and teenagers in my neighborhood, just from learning about a couple of the different species, have really taken it upon themselves to always pick up their trash after each other, to say hi to the linden trees when they pass them. They know when the blackberries are in season. They know when the black raspberries are in season. They know when the thimbleberries are in season. It's really amazing to watch because I think we talk a lot these days about kids not having enough connection with much of anybody. You know, you're on your phone, you're on video games. We took a lot of third places away from them to hang out, so I don't think it's their fault. But one of the most beautiful things I think that comes out of foraging, and one of the most joyful things that I think I forage for, is fostering a really deep love for any and all wild spaces, regardless of how urban or wild it happens to be. So I hope that you all take that joy with you too. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Sorry that I talked for so long.
No, this is good. We are. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you all for coming. We're not going to have time for a Q&A tonight because we have got to go to another appointment. But Alexis is going to stay 5 minutes. So if you have a personal question, you can come up and ask Alexis, in for 5 minutes. Alexis, I'm going to pull you away in 5 minutes. Thank you all for being here tonight.